The carriage wheels churned through the Virginia dust as Senator Benjamin Wade adjusted his silk top hat and peered through the morning haze toward the distant Confederate lines. It was July 21st, 1861, and what had begun as a genteel excursion from Washington was about to become a nightmare that would haunt the Union for years to come. Congressman Alfred Ely laughed heartily as he raised his opera glasses, scanning the peaceful countryside near Manassas Junction. "My dear Wade, this rebellion shall be crushed before tea time. General McDowell assures us the Confederate rabble will scatter like leaves before our disciplined forces." Around them, dozens of carriages filled with Washington's elite had made the 30-mile journey to witness what they believed would be the war's decisive and final battle. The spectacle resembled a grand outdoor theater more than a military engagement. Ladies in their finest summer dresses spread picnic blankets on nearby hills, while gentlemen in frock coats shared bottles of champagne and discussed the inevitable Union victory. Children played among the carriages as their parents pointed toward the distant formations of blue-clad soldiers advancing across the rolling Virginia landscape. Brigadier General Irvin McDowell had risen before dawn, his stomach churning with more than pre-battle nerves. The weight of political pressure bore down upon him like a physical burden. President Lincoln, Congress, and the Northern press all demanded immediate action against the Confederate forces gathered around Manassas. The 3-month enlistments of his volunteer soldiers would expire soon, and public opinion demanded that this rebellion be crushed quickly and decisively. McDowell surveyed his 35,000 troops as they prepared for the attack. Most were green volunteers who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Their uniforms were a rainbow of state militia colors. Some regiments still wore gray, causing dangerous confusion on the battlefield. The general had pleaded for more time to train these citizen soldiers, but political necessity had overruled military prudence. On the Confederate side, Brigadier General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard stood atop Henry House Hill, his field glasses tracking the Union advance. The Creole general's 22,000 troops were equally inexperienced, but they held the advantage of defensive positions along Bull Run Creek. Beauregard had positioned his forces carefully, knowing that the winding stream would channel the Union attack into predictable crossing points. According to historical accounts, documented by the American Battlefield Trust, the morning began with optimism on both sides. Though the Union spectators remained blissfully unaware of the military realities unfolding before them, Colonel Nathan Evans commanded the Confederate left flank at Stone Bridge, where he expected the main Union assault. His South Carolina and Louisiana troops crouched behind earthworks, watching the morning mist rise from Bull Run's waters. Evans was a West Point graduate who understood that appearances could deceive. The Union demonstration at Stone Bridge might be a feint designed to mask the real attack elsewhere. As the sun climbed higher, the sound of artillery fire began to echo across the countryside. The picnicking spectators cheered each distant boom, assuming every cannon shot brought the rebellion closer to its end. They had no comprehension that they were witnessing the opening act of a 4-year tragedy that would consume over 600,000 American lives. McDowell's battle plan was ambitious but risky. While one division demonstrated at Stone Bridge to hold Confederate attention, his main force would march north to cross Bull Run at Sudley Ford, then sweep down upon the Confederate left flank. It was a classic turning movement that looked impressive on paper, but required precise timing and experienced troops to execute properly. The civilian spectators continued their revelries as the morning wore on, completely oblivious to the fact that their presence would soon complicate one of the most significant military disasters in American history. Their carriages and picnic grounds would become obstacles in a desperate retreat, and their confident laughter would transform into panicked screams before the day ended. The stage was set for a battle that would shatter illusions on both sides and announce to the world that the American Civil War would be neither quick nor bloodless. Colonel Ambrose Burnside's Rhode Island regiment splashed across Sudley Ford in the early morning hours, their boots squelching in the muddy creek bottom. As they executed McDowell's turning movement, the flanking column had marched through the night, and the men were already exhausted before the fighting began. Burnside, destined for greater commands and greater failures, urged his troops forward through the thick Virginia woods toward their objective on the Confederate left. The sound of their approach carried through the forest to Colonel Evans's alert ears. The South Carolina commander had noticed that the Union demonstration at Stone Bridge lacked the intensity of a real assault. When dust clouds appeared north of his position, Evans made a crucial decision that would define the battle's opening phase. He left a small force to watch Stone Bridge and rushed the bulk of his command north to meet Burnside's flanking force. The first significant clash occurred near Matthews Hill around 10 o'clock in the morning. The Rhode Island troops, advancing in neat parade ground formations, suddenly found themselves facing determined Confederate resistance in thick timber. The crack of musket fire shattered the morning calm as blue and gray lines blazed away at each other through the smoke and shadows of the Virginia forest. Captain Charles Griffin's battery of regular artillery unlimbered on the hill, their bronze cannon barrels gleaming in the morning sun. The professional soldiers worked their guns with mechanical precision, sending shells screaming into the Confederate positions. The raw Confederate troops, many of whom had never experienced artillery fire, began to waver under the bombardment. Meanwhile, the Washington Spectators had moved closer to the action, their carriages now positioned on hills that provided excellent views of the unfolding drama. Senator Wade continued his confident commentary, pointing out to his companions how the Union forces were executing what appeared to be a textbook flanking maneuver. The distant battle looked like a grand military pageant from their safe vantage point. Colonel William Tecumseh Sherman's brigade forded Bull Run at an undefended crossing, adding weight to the Union turning movement. Sherman, whose name would become synonymous with total war, was still learning his trade as he led his Green Volunteers into their first battle. His men advanced steadily across the rolling terrain, their regimental flags snapping in the morning breeze. The Confederate line began to buckle under mounting pressure. Evans's small force, though fighting with desperate courage, could not hold against the growing Union numbers. Confederate reinforcements were rushing north from the Stone Bridge area, but they were arriving piecemeal and going into action without coordination. Brigadier General Barnard Bee's brigade arrived on Matthews Hill just as Evans's men were beginning to fall back. The South Carolina general tried to form a new defensive line, but his Alabama and Mississippi troops were as green as their Union opponents. The confusion of battle smoke, noise, and conflicting orders began to take its toll on both armies. Union advance seemed unstoppable as more brigades crossed Bull Run and deployed for attack. McDowell's plan was working better than he had dared hope. The Confederate left was crumbling, and victory appeared within reach. The spectators cheered as they watched their boys in blue drive the rebels from one position after another. Colonel James Cameron, brother of Secretary of War Simon Cameron, led his Pennsylvania regiment in a charge that carried Matthews Hill. The political appointee waved his sword and shouted encouragement to his men as they advanced through the smoke and confusion. For a moment, it seemed that the amateur soldiers on both sides might actually deliver the quick, decisive battle that both governments desired. But battles are won by reserves and reinforcements, not by the troops who begin the fighting. As the Union forces celebrated their initial success, Confederate Brigadier General Joseph Johnston's army was arriving by railroad from the Shenandoah Valley. These reinforcements, led by Brigadier General Thomas Jackson's Virginia Brigade, were already moving toward the sound of the guns. The Confederate retreat was becoming more organized as it fell back toward Henry House Hill. General Beauregard was skillfully shifting troops from his right flank, where no Union attack had developed, to reinforce his crumbling left. The stage was being set for the battle's crucial phase, though the confident spectators still believed they were witnessing the rebellion's death throes. Unknown to the celebrating civilians, the tide of battle was about to turn in a way that would transform their pleasant outing into a nightmare of panic and flight. The Confederate retreat reached Henry House Hill around noon, with exhausted Southern troops streaming past the modest frame house where 85-year-old Judith Henry lay bedridden. The elderly woman had refused to evacuate despite the approaching battle, and her house now stood directly in the path of the Union advance. The sight would soon become emblematic of how this war would bring destruction to civilian homes across America. Brigadier General Thomas Jonathan Jackson's Virginia Brigade had arrived on Henry House Hill just as the Confederate line threatened to collapse entirely. Jackson, a former professor at Virginia Military Institute, known for his eccentric habits and stern religious faith, positioned his 5 regiments in a defensive line behind the crest of the hill. His men lay down in the grass, invisible to the advancing Union forces. General Barnard B., his own brigade shattered by the morning's fighting, rode up to Jackson in desperation. Confederate forces were streaming past them in disorder, and the Union attack seemed irresistible. B pointed toward Jackson's motionless line and shouted to his retreating men, "Look, there's Jackson standing like a stone wall. Rally behind the Virginians." Those words would immortalize Jackson with his famous nickname, though B himself would fall mortally wounded minutes later. Captain Charles Griffin's Union battery had advanced to within 300 yards of the Cauca Confederate line, so close that the artillerymen could see individual enemy soldiers. Griffin's regular army gunners were among the best in the world, and their accurate fire had been devastating Confederate positions all morning. Now they unlimbered their cannon and prepared to blast Jackson's brigade from the hilltop. The Union infantry advance was becoming disorganized as regiments became mixed together in the excitement of apparent victory. Colonel William Sherman's brigade approached from the north while Colonel Orlando Wilcox's men climbed the hill from the east. The blue-clad soldiers were tired from hours of fighting and marching, but victory seemed within their grasp. From their observation points, the Washington spectators could see the climactic moment approaching. The Confederate resistance appeared to be crumbling, and Union forces were converging on what looked like the last enemy stronghold. Senator Wade raised his champagne glass in a premature toast of victory, while ladies applauded through their parasols as if watching a particularly exciting horse race. Jackson had instructed his men to remain hidden until the Union forces came within effective musket range. The Virginia troops, many of them cadets and professors from the Military Institute, lay silent in the summer grass while cannonballs whistled overhead. Their commander sat motionless on his horse, seemingly oblivious to the danger as he sucked down a lemon, one of his many peculiar habits. The 11th New York Fire Zouaves, resplendent in their red baggy trousers and Turkish-style uniforms, advanced up Henry House Hill with their characteristic swagger. These New York City firemen had become celebrities for their exotic uniforms and drill displays, but they were about to discover that battlefield reality differed drastically from parade ground pageantry. At the crucial moment, Jackson gave the order his men had been waiting for. The entire Virginia Brigade rose from concealment and delivered a devastating volley into the surprised Union ranks. The coordinated musket fire cut down dozens of Federal soldiers and sent the rest reeling backward in shock and confusion. Griffin's artillery battery found itself in a desperate situation. Confederate infantry had appeared seemingly from nowhere, and his guns were too close to enemy lines to escape quickly. The artillerymen worked frantically to limber their cannon while Confederate bullets whined around them. Several horses were shot down, tangling the gun teams in their harnesses. The tide of battle was turning with stunning suddenness. Union regiments that had been advancing confidently moments before were now falling back in disorder. The Confederate line, reinforced by Jackson's fresh troops, was not only holding but beginning to counterattack. The morning's easy victory was evaporating like morning mist. Confusion reigned supreme as both armies struggled to maintain control over their scattered forces. Uniforms provided little guidance. Some Confederate units wore blue while some Union regiments still wore gray. In the smoke and chaos of battle, soldiers fired on their own comrades, while letting enemies pass unharmed. The spectators on the distant hills were beginning to notice that something had gone wrong with their anticipated victory. The Union advance had stalled, and through their opera glasses they could see blue-clad figures streaming back down Henry House Hill. Concerned murmurs began to replace confident laughter as the civilian observers tried to understand what they were witnessing. Jackson's stand had bought precious time for Confederate reinforcements to arrive and deploy. The battle that had seemed decided in the Union's favor was about to enter its most critical and decisive phase. Colonel Jeb Stuart's 1st Virginia Cavalry appeared on the Union right flank like a thunderbolt from clear skies. The young Confederate commander, whose flowing beard and plumed hat made him look like a romantic cavalier, had spotted an opportunity that would launch his legendary reputation. His 400 horsemen swept down upon the surprised Union infantry, with sabers flashing and the rebel yell echoing across the battlefield. The psychological impact of the cavalry charge far exceeded its tactical significance. Union soldiers, who had never faced mounted troops, panicked at the sight of horses and riders bearing down upon them. Entire regiments broke and fled without offering serious resistance, abandoning their equipment and positions in headlong flight toward Bull Run's protective waters. General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard sensed that the critical moment had arrived. The Confederate commander, resplendent in his dress uniform despite the battle's chaos, ordered a general advance along his entire line. Southern troops who had been retreating all morning suddenly found themselves moving forward as their opponents began to give way. The 33rd Virginia Infantry, part of Colonel Arthur Cummings's brigade, charged across Henry House Hill with a distinctive rebel yell that would terrorize Union armies throughout the war. These farmers and shopkeepers from the Shenandoah Valley had learned their battle cry from local hunters, and its wild, keening sound unnerved soldiers accustomed to more conventional military commands. Captain Griffin's battery was overrun in the confusion. Confederate infantry swarmed around the guns, bayoneting the horses and capturing the bronze cannon that had dominated the morning's fighting. Griffin himself was wounded and captured, though he would later be exchanged. The loss of these regular Army artillery pieces was both tactically and symbolically devastating for Union morale. The Washington spectators were now witnessing scenes that contradicted everything they had expected. Through their telescopes and opera glasses, they could see Union soldiers streaming away from the battlefield in obvious retreat. The confident predictions of a quick victory were being replaced by growing anxiety as the magnitude of the disaster became apparent. Representative Alfred Ely, who had boasted that morning about witnessing the rebellion's end, found himself uncomfortably close to Confederate skirmishers. The New York congressman discovered that his civilian clothes provided no protection from enemy bullets, and he began an undignified scramble toward his carriage as Confederate infantry approached his observation point. Colonel William Sherman attempted to rally his broken brigade, but the volunteers who had advanced so confidently that morning were now in full retreat. Sherman, his uniform torn and his horse shot from under him, watched in frustration as military discipline dissolved into individual panic. The future march to the sea was getting his first bitter lesson in the realities of commanding volunteer troops. The Confederate advance gained momentum as success bred success. Southern regiments that had been demoralized by the morning's defeats now pressed forward eagerly, sensing victory within their grasp. General Johnston's reinforcements from the Shenandoah Valley were arriving continuously, feeding fresh troops into the attack just as Union resistance began to crumble. Colonel Nathan Evans, the South Carolina officer whose stubborn defense had begun the day's fighting, was wounded but remained on the battlefield to witness the dramatic reversal. His small brigade had been nearly destroyed in the morning's fighting, but their sacrifice had bought time for Confederate reinforcements to arrive and deploy effectively. The Henry House, which had stood in the center of the morning's fighting, was now a Confederate stronghold. Old Judith Henry had been killed by a Union shell, one of the war's first civilian casualties, and her home had become a symbol of how this conflict would bring destruction to innocent families throughout America. Union artillery batteries that had dominated the morning's fighting were now limbering up and retreating as rapidly as possible. The professional artillerymen recognized military disaster when they saw it, and they were determined not to lose their valuable guns to Confederate capture. Horse teams galloped toward Bull Run with cannon bouncing behind them and Confederate cavalry in hot pursuit. As historical accounts from the Smithsonian Institution document, the momentum of battle had shifted completely, with nearly 900 men from both sides killed and another 2,500 wounded in the day's fighting. Retreat was becoming a rout as individual panic spread through the Union ranks. Soldiers threw away their muskets and equipment to run faster, while officers lost control of their scattered commands. The orderly military formations of the morning had dissolved into a mob of frightened men seeking only to escape the Confederate counterattack. The disaster that would reshape American perceptions of the war was accelerating beyond anyone's ability to control or contain it. General Irvin McDowell sat his horse at a crossroads near Cub Run, watching his army disintegrate before his eyes. The methodical advance that had begun so promisingly 12 hours earlier was now a complete rout. Soldiers streamed past him in panic, throwing away muskets, cartridge boxes, and knapsacks in their desperate flight toward Washington. The general's carefully planned battle had become an unmitigated disaster. The narrow stone bridge over Bull Run became a bottleneck of terror as thousands of retreating soldiers tried to cross simultaneously. Men pushed and shoved, trampling their comrades in their panic to escape the pursuing Confederates. Supply wagons overturned in the creek bed, blocking the crossing and forcing soldiers to wade through the muddy water while Confederate artillery shells exploded around them. Colonel Dixon Miles, commanding the Union Reserve Division, had been drinking heavily throughout the day, a habit that would eventually end his military career. His intoxicated condition prevented any effective effort to establish a defensive line that might have covered the retreat. Instead of organized resistance, the Union Army simply melted away in individual terror. The civilian spectators found themselves caught in the chaos of military disaster. Senator Benjamin Wade's elegant carriage was surrounded by panicked soldiers who demanded transportation away from the battlefield. The senator's driver whipped his horses frantically as congressmen and socialites who had come to witness a victory found themselves fleeing for their lives alongside the defeated army. Representative Alfred Ely was not so fortunate. The New York politician had lingered too long at his observation point and found himself captured by Confederate soldiers who seemed as surprised as he was by the dramatic turn of events. Ely would spend several months in Richmond's Libby prison, becoming one of the war's most prominent civilian prisoners. The road back to Washington became clogged with an incredible mixture of military and civilian vehicles. Ambulances carrying wounded soldiers competed for space with carriages filled with terrified spectators. Artillery pieces raced alongside private buggies, while mounted officers galloped past pedestrians struggling through the Virginia dust. Jeb Stuart's Confederate cavalry pursued the fleeing Union forces with gleeful enthusiasm. The young cavalry commander and his troopers captured dozens of prisoners in abandoned supply wagons, though they lacked the numbers to press their advantage decisively. Stuart would later write that the pursuit resembled a fox hunt more than serious military operations. The psychological impact of the defeat spread faster than the retreating soldiers themselves. Telegraph lines carried news of the disaster to Washington, where government officials had been confidently expecting reports of victory. President Lincoln, who had spent the day anxiously awaiting news from the front, received the shocking reports of complete military collapse. Confederate General Thomas Jackson, despite his brigade's crucial role in turning the battle, was frustrated by the failure to pursue the beaten enemy more aggressively. Stonewall Jackson believed that Confederate forces should have pressed their advantage and possibly captured Washington itself. His aggressive instincts would later make him one of the war's most feared commanders. The retreat continued through the night, as exhausted Union soldiers stumbled toward the safety of Washington's fortifications. Many troops became separated from their regiments and wandered through the Virginia countryside, seeking roads that would lead them away from the battlefield. Local residents watched in amazement as the supposedly invincible Union Army dissolved into a mob of frightened individuals. Supply trains that had advanced confidently that morning were now abandoned along the roadside. Confederate soldiers would feast on Union rations for days afterward, while Southern quartermasters marveled at the quality and quantity of equipment left behind by the fleeing enemy. The material losses were almost as significant as the human casualties. The myth of a short, bloodless war died on the road from Bull Run to Washington. Both Northern and Southern civilians had expected their citizen soldiers to settle the secession crisis with minimal bloodshed, but the reality of modern warfare had proven far different from romantic expectations, as documented by the U.S. Senate's historical records. The scenes of panic and flight would become seared into American memory as the Great Skedaddle, a humiliating reminder that military success required more than patriotic enthusiasm and political rhetoric. The defeated Union Army would require months to recover from this psychological blow, while Confederate confidence soared to dangerous levels. The easy victory convinced many Southerners that one Confederate could whip 10 Yankees, a fatal overconfidence that would contribute to future strategic mistakes. By midnight, the remnants of McDowell's army were struggling into Washington's defensive perimeter, bringing with them news of the most shocking military defeat in American history up to that point. The first refugees from the battlefield reached Washington's outskirts around midnight, their wild-eyed accounts of disaster spreading panic through the capital streets. Soldiers stumbled through the darkness, their uniforms torn and muddy, carrying tales of Confederate cavalry pursuit and complete military collapse. The confident citizens who had waved goodbye to their boys in blue that morning now faced the terrifying possibility that enemy forces might be approaching their own city. President Abraham Lincoln paced the floors of the White House, his tall frame bent with worry as conflicting reports arrived from the battlefield. Telegraph operators worked frantically to maintain communication with the retreating army, but many lines had been cut by panicked soldiers or Confederate raiders. The president, who had reluctantly approved McDowell's advance, now faced the consequences of premature military action. Secretary of War Simon Cameron rushed between government buildings, trying to organize some defense for the capital while mourning his brother James, who had been killed leading Pennsylvania troops in the morning's fighting. The political appointee who had pushed for quick military action now confronted the reality that wars could not be won by enthusiasm alone. General Winfield Scott, the aged hero of the Mexican War, struggled to establish defensive positions around Washington despite his physical infirmities. The 75-year-old commander had opposed the premature advance, preferring his methodical Anaconda plan to strangle the Confederacy slowly. Now his worst fears were being realized as untrained volunteers fled in panic toward the capital. Streets of Washington filled with congressmen, senators, and government officials fleeing toward Baltimore and points north. Many politicians who had demanded immediate military action were now among the first to seek safety elsewhere. Hotels emptied as guests checked out hurriedly, while railroad stations became packed with citizens seeking transportation away from the threatened capital. Newspaper correspondents, who had accompanied the army to witness a Union victory, found themselves writing very different stories. William Howard Russell of the London Times already skeptical of American military capabilities, described scenes of panic and cowardice that would embarrass the Union cause in European capitals. His dispatches would influence British attitudes toward potential recognition of Confederate independence. The retreating soldiers brought with them evidence of their defeat in the form of abandoned equipment and wounded comrades. Hospitals throughout Washington filled with casualties from the battle, while military surgeons worked desperately to treat wounds inflicted by modern rifles and artillery. The reality of 19th century warfare came home to civilians who had never witnessed such carnage. Georgetown's residents barricaded their streets and prepared for Confederate occupation, while government clerks burned sensitive documents to prevent their capture. The Treasury Department made preparations to evacuate gold reserves, and State Department officials prepared to relocate diplomatic operations if necessary. The sudden possibility of losing the national capital created administrative chaos throughout the federal government. General McDowell finally reached Washington on July 22, his military reputation destroyed by the day's events. General who had reluctantly accepted command of an untrained army now faced criticism from politicians who had pushed him into premature action. His careful planning had been overwhelmed by the inexperience of his troops and the unexpected effectiveness of Confederate resistance. Colonel William Sherman, his uniform still stained with battle smoke, reported to government officials on the complete breakdown of military discipline he had witnessed. The future architect of total war was learning hard lessons about the difference between volunteer enthusiasm and professional military training. His experiences at Bull Run would influence his later emphasis on rigorous military preparation. Civilian spectators who survived the retreat brought their own tales of horror and embarrassment. Society ladies who had packed picnic lunches found themselves trudging through Virginia mud alongside common soldiers. Congressmen who had boasted of Confederate cowardice now faced questions about their own hasty departures from the battlefield. Confederate General Joseph Johnston decided against pursuing the beaten Union Army toward Washington, a decision that would be debated by military historians for generations. The Confederate commander lacked sufficient cavalry and artillery to maintain pursuit, and his own troops were exhausted by the day's fighting. The opportunity to capture the Union capital may have been lost by excessive caution. As dawn broke over Washington on July 22nd, the magnitude of the disaster became apparent to government officials and civilians alike. The Union Army, that had marched out so confidently 36 hours earlier, had been reduced to scattered fragments, seeking shelter behind the capital's fortifications. The war that many had expected to end quickly had instead begun with a humiliating defeat that would reshape American attitudes toward the conflict. The illusion of easy victory had been shattered by the reality of modern warfare, and both North and South would need to prepare for a much longer and bloodier struggle than anyone had imagined possible. Dawn on July 22nd revealed the full scope of the Union disaster to shocked Washington residents. Pennsylvania Avenue, normally bustling with political activity, was now clogged with exhausted soldiers, abandoned equipment, and civilians fleeing the approaching Confederate army that existed more in imagination than reality. The confident capital that had sent its boys off to crush the rebellion now faced the possibility of enemy occupation. President Lincoln convened an emergency cabinet meeting to assess the military situation and plan the government's response. Secretary of State William Seward, who had predicted the rebellion would be over in 90 days, sat silently as reports of the defeat continued to arrive. The political leaders who had demanded immediate action now confronted the consequences of premature military operations. General Winfield Scott, despite his advanced age and physical limitations, worked tirelessly to establish defensive positions around Washington. The old soldier knew that Confederate forces were probably too exhausted and disorganized to mount an immediate assault on the capital, but public panic demanded visible preparations for defense. Earthworks began appearing on the Virginia hills. Overlooking the city, the casualty reports from Bull Run horrified civilians who had expected warfare to resemble romantic novels rather than brutal reality. Union losses totaled approximately 3,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, while Confederate casualties numbered about 2,000. These figures seemed enormous to Americans who had no experience with modern military combat. Foreign observers drew ominous conclusions from the Union defeat. British officials began reconsidering their neutral stance toward the American conflict, while French diplomats questioned whether the United States government could survive a prolonged civil war. The international implications of Bull Run would influence European attitudes toward potential Confederate recognition for months to come. The Northern press, which had demanded immediate military action for months, now faced the embarrassing task of explaining the disaster to their readers. Editorial writers who had proclaimed Confederate cowardice were forced to acknowledge Southern military effectiveness. The romantic view of warfare that had dominated American popular culture began giving way to grimmer realities. Confederate celebrations in Richmond and throughout the South reached euphoric levels as news of the victory spread. Southern newspapers proclaimed that one Confederate soldier was worth 10 Yankees, while political leaders spoke confidently of European recognition and eventual independence. The easy victory convinced many Southerners that the North would abandon its war effort rather than face further defeats. General McDowell submitted his resignation immediately after the battle, though President Lincoln refused to accept it initially. The general who had warned against premature action found himself blamed for a defeat that resulted largely from political pressure and inadequate military preparation. His military career was effectively ended by Bull Run, though he would continue to serve in subordinate positions. The 3-month volunteers, whose imminent discharge had provided one justification for the battle, were released from service as scheduled, further reducing Union military strength at a critical moment. Many of these men returned home with tales of military incompetence and Confederate fighting ability that dampened Northern enthusiasm for the war effort. Recruitment efforts that had been languishing suddenly intensified as the reality of Confederate military capability became apparent. President Lincoln authorized the enlistment of additional volunteer regiments for 3-year terms, acknowledging that the conflict would require sustained effort rather than a single decisive campaign. The myth of citizen soldiers easily defeating professional military forces died in the mud along Bull Run Creek. Both North and South began the painful process of creating real armies capable of sustained combat operations. The romantic phase of the American Civil War ended with the retreat from Manassas Junction. Thomas Jackson's performance at Henry House Hill earned him promotion to Major General and command of Confederate forces in the Shenandoah Valley, where he would win additional fame in the spring of 1862. Stonewall Jackson had found his calling as one of the war's most aggressive and effective commanders. The civilian spectators who had treated the battle like a sporting event returned to Washington with a new understanding of warfare's reality. Their picnic baskets and opera glasses became symbols of American naivety about the conflict that would consume over 600,000 lives before its conclusion. Bull Run's lessons would influence military policy for the remainder of the war. Both armies recognized the need for extended training, professional leadership, and realistic planning. The easy victories that both sides had expected were replaced by acknowledgement that modern warfare required careful preparation and sustained commitment. The battle that began as a grand spectacle ended as a sobering reminder that civil wars are won by endurance rather than enthusiasm, and that citizen soldiers require professional training before they can face the realities of 19th century combat.